Today we'll be studying a simple concept called simple interest. It's really very simple. Now, in order to calculate simple interest is calculated as a percentage of the, if you think about it, the original amount on an investment, otherwise known as the principal. Okay? Now, the principal you can think of as the starting amount, okay, on an investment or a loan using the formula I is equal to PRT, where the following is true. Now, remember, we're using that equation, I is equal to PRT. Now, I represents the interest that we earn over time, okay? And now, when we talk about time, we're usually talking about time in a number of years or a fraction of years. When we talk about P, we're talking about the principal, also known as the starting amount that we described earlier. Okay? That is also known as the original amount, and sometimes you'll hear me say original amount when I'm talking about this. When we talk about interest, we're talking about the interest rate that we are getting on the amount of money. And that's always expressed as a decimal. Okay, now remember, interest rate is normally a percent. And what we're going to do is change that percent into a decimal. Okay, and you always know that if you have a number for the interest, we take that number and divide by 100. Okay. Now, when we talk about T is just the length of time that this money has been sitting in the bank and making interest. And we basically express that in terms of years. And when we talk of these years, we're talking about fractions of years or whole numbered years. Now, when we talk about the simple interest added to the principal, okay, we're talking about the total amount of money, okay? So that is the principal plus the interest, okay? Now, the interest rate is an important thing that we have to study. So let's take a look at that by taking interest rates, dividing by 100, and using only two places to the left, or moving two places to the left, okay? So if we have 13%, we can write this as 13 divided by 100, which gives us 0.13. If you're really good at that, you can just do that. You can go straight to the very end at all times. Now for 0.25, we're going to use the other method where we move the decimal over two spaces to the left. So we write 2.5 as our decimal, okay, as our percentage. And then we move the decimal two places to the left, and we put zeros in where we have a loop. Okay, so you notice here, I'm making you write this out. Just make sure you understand that you put your zeros in, and your last loop forms your last decimal, and then you've got 0.025 as your final decimal. Okay, now for the last question, I am not so confident with 0.5 and moving decimals over, so I just quickly go and divide by 100 right away. Punch it in my calculator, and I get 0.005 as my decimal. And that is what I have for my decimal. So when we're calculating interest rates, we need to be able to do that. Now let's talk about time in terms of years. So we're going to express all of these times in terms of years. So remember, you have 24 months, okay? With 24 months, we have to consider that there are 12 months in every single year. So when we take 24 and we need to turn it into years, we have to take 24 divided by 12 to give me 2. Now let's go and take a look at 8 months. For 8 months, we have to divide by 12 again. So we end up with 0.75 when we calculate it. We can do the same thing for weeks. So when we have 14 weeks, we have to divide by a total of 52 weeks because 52 weeks are in a year. Punch that in your calculator and you end up with 0.27. Now, let's just quickly put a reminder here. The reason why we divided by 52 weeks is because there are 52 weeks in 1 year. Now, the next question we need to think about is what happens when we have a certain number of days. Okay? So when we talk about days, we got to remember that there are 365 days in every year. Okay? And based on that, we have to take our 82 and we're going to have to divide by 365. And that gives us a decimal of 0.22. Now, in the simple interest formula, time has to be expressed in years. The months need to be divided by 12, the weeks need to be divided by 52, and the days need to be divided by 365. Now, for us, in this practice problem that we're going to do, we're only going to use up to 2 decimal places, okay? Or if you really want to be very specific, very accurate, use the fractions that you come up with before you get to the final decimal of 2 decimal places when we do our calculations for I is equal to PRT. All right, and that's it. Now, let's move on to the next part of today's lesson. So for example 1, what I want you to do is I want you to find the interest as a calculation from I is equal to PRT. Now, when we use this, you notice I'm going to write all my variables down the side. I start with I and I end with T. This will allow me to fill out the information I have. Now, this problem says to calculate how much interest is earned if $2,000, which is our principal, P, and it's invested at 4.5%. So let's go and change that into a decimal. It means the rate, R, is 4.5 divided by 100, which comes out to 0.045. And our time is determined by the last part of our problem, which says that we have to do this for 26 weeks. Now we need to convert that by dividing by 52, because there's 52 weeks in a year. And so T is 26 divided by 52, which gives us 0.5. Now, if you're good, you would just take the 0.45, the 2,000, and the 0.5 and multiply them all together in I is equal to PRT. Most mathematicians literally write it like this. I is equal to 2,000 times 0.045 and then 0.5, and then punch that in your calculator. You end up with I is equal to 45. Now what does that mean? There we'd say the interest earned is $45. Now what you can do, if you, instead of basically calculating all of these decimals here, which are useful, you could just punch this in here and this in here and do your calculation if you wanted to. It's up to you. I leave that to you. So now, the last part of the problem is how much is the investment worth? That is actually talking about the total, which is just A is equal to I plus P. So, let's go.
A equals, we don't know what that is. P equals, we do know what that is, which is $2,000. And I is literally 45. So A is equal to P plus I. And we end up with 2,000 plus 45, which is $2,045. And those are our answers for each part, and we have to do our final statement. In 26 weeks, the investment is worth $2,045, and we're done. Now, let's focus on the next part of our problem here. When we talk about the concept of simple interest, we can take a look at this triangle here. This triangle tells us that I is equal to P times R times T. So I would tend to always write that this is a times here, and then we have another times here, and then this line that's underneath my I means I divided by those things. So let's say I want to find I. What I would do is I literally just take the I, cover it up, and that would mean that we would have P times R times T. So that is what we would get here. On our first equation, I is equal to PRT. So in order to find P, imagine we take this triangle, and what we're going to do is we're literally just going to cover up the P, which means that we've got I over R times T. So let's go and write that out. So we have I divided by, in brackets, R times T. Now, if I was looking for the rate, what I would do is I would do the same thing again that we did before. We're just going to cover up the R, which means that we have I divided by P times T. So let's do that right now. So we have I divided by, in brackets, P times T. Now, let's put a little addition. After we find our rate, we must, after calculation, we must change to a percentage. Change the decimal to a percentage, i.e. multiply by 100%. So now let's go and calculate T. So let's say I want to calculate T. I cover up my T in my triangle. So now that means I have I over P times R. I divided by, in brackets, P times R. And that is your time in weeks. So now let's go through some simple problems to find out P, R, and T. So this first problem is to calculate the principal. The principal, it says how much principal is needed to earn. Well, we got $500 in 2 years invested at 2.5%. Simple interest. So remember, our basic equation for our interest is, for our principal is P is equal to I divided by, in brackets, R times T. So let's go and put our variables down that we need. We needed I, we have P, we have R, and we have T, just like before. Now, we do know I. Let's see, our interest is $500. Isn't that needed? So this part here is our interest I. The T is 2 years. T is 2 years. It's already in years, still don't need to change it, but our 2.5% needs to be changed into a decimal. So we go 2.5 divided by 100 equals 0.025. And we punch that into our equation, and we have 500 divided by, in brackets, 0.025 times 2. So what this tells us is, if you're going to do this calculation, you're going to actually write on your calculator 500, you're going to go divided by, and then you're going to use the parenthesis 0.25, and then times 2, and then with an ending bracket, and then you get your answer. And in this case, when we do our final answer, we find out that our principal is $10,000. So we do our final statement as well. So now that is how we get our final answer. And we say we need $10,000 to be invested, or we could say we could start with $10,000. Now let's move on to the next problem. Now we're going to try and calculate the rate of simple interest. So I'm going to set up the equation, and then we'll do the problem. Now, this problem says, what rate of simple interest is needed to get $7,000 to grow? So we need $7,000, but it says 7,000 growing to 10,000. So if it grows to 10,000, that there was a difference of 3,000, so that is our interest. Now, our principal, our amount that we start with, is 7,000. Our rate, we don't know, but our time is 5 years. So let's punch that into our equation here. Now, you do your calculations and you end up with R is equal to 0.086. But we need to change it into a decimal, into an actual percentage. So therefore, the rate is 8.6%. And how did we get that? We basically took 0.086 and times it by 100 to get 8.6. And that is where we got that number. Now let's do our final question. How long would it take 15,000 to grow to 2,000 simple interest at a rate of 3%? So we're looking for time, and time is T, which equals, well, I divided by P times R. So let's write out our I, P, R, T as before. We don't know what our time is. We do know what our rate is, which is 3%, which is 3 divided by 100, which equals 0.03. We know that our principal is, let's see, 15,000. And we know that our interest is growing up by 2,000. So we get 2,000. So let's just punch all that numbers in and you'll see what your answer is. So once you substitute, you get all of this, 2,000 divided by 5,000 times 0.03, which gives us T is equal to 11.11. We would say, therefore, it would take about 11.11 years.